When we talked about Trudeau in this sort of space around Confederation, around the Constitution in 1982, one of the things that I said earlier was that charisma, in a lot of ways, is a way of making people care about certain things. So, in this conversation, we're going to talk about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that is one of the tools that Pierre Trudeau is using to convince Canadians to care. Okay? Because most Canadians, most of the time, don't care at all what's in the constitutional documents. That's not important because I'm going to ask all of you to stop and think for a second and go, has a constitutional question ever been relevant in my day-to-day life? Because the answer for almost all Canadians is no, why would I care? However, in order to convince you to care long enough to at least pass the constitutional repatriation in 1982, one of the things that Trudeau is leaning on is the creation of a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that is the part of Canada's constitutional documents that Canadians mostly care about more. Because this is the document that formally enshrines a lot of freedoms that do actually touch sort of their day-to-day lives in terms of that. And this establishes a whole bunch of freedoms and protections for both groups and individuals in the context of Canada that we sort of take for granted as part of what's going on. So the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the formal document that guarantees freedom of conscience. So that's the freedom to believe whatever you would like to believe. Freedom of association. That is the freedom to sort of join and connect with whoever else you want to connect to. Freedom of expression. Freedom of peaceful assembly. These are the freedoms that protect, for example, your ability to protest, your ability to say things that criticize the government. Those are things that Canadians actually do care about in a way that they really don't care about sort of the formal amendment structure of the constitutional like that doesn't matter to most people most of the time. Okay, I will sort of highlight that this also protects Canadians from discrimination on any number of statuses. So race, religion, creed, relevant in a sort of more contemporary context. It protects sexual orientation, but not gender expression. So it protects you if you are gay or lesbian or bisexual, but it does not protect you if you were born biologically female but identify as male or vice versa. So there's some questions in that. At the collective level, this document also includes protections for minority language education. So, for example, to receive an education in French outside of Quebec and English inside of Quebec, those sorts of pieces. Freedom of mobility. So this is why, for example, the province of Alberta cannot prevent people from moving from British Columbia to Alberta. There's freedom of mobility across provinces. There's freedoms about equality before the law. So it's impossible to create sort of legal arguments around this. We've had some brief conversations in our in our discussion boards around, for example, the Gladue principle about Indigenous people being treated as equal before the law. And that's part of that sort of conversation. It's sort of protected in the Charter. This is also where you get things like protection from unreasonable search and seizure, so it limits the rule that what police can and cannot do in that sort of space. And it also sort of moves a little bit past the B&B Commission, right? When we look at the B&B Commission in the 70s, like the 60s and 70s, one of the things that you're looking at is that assumption about bilingualism and biculturalism. For those of you who don't have too much Latin and Greek, bi is two. So that is the assumption about Anglophone and Francophone. In the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there's a clause that writes about a guarantee of the interpretation of this charter in a multicultural context. So there's a recognition in the document, for example, that what is necessary to protect freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, for one group of people might look different than it needs to look for other people, in the sense that if your religious tradition is built around, for example, church buildings, then those protections for church buildings and your ability to build them are going to look different than if your religious tradition is built around something else, right? So, for example, it's not about you need to have one day off to be able to sort of practice religious rites, because that doesn't cover, for example, Muslims who also need protections to be able to sort of leave their places of employment and their work 5 times a day to be able to pray. So there's an understanding that these protections might need to look a little bit different for other people. I will also say that none of the freedoms in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada anyway are listed as absolute. So what they the sort of formal structure around that is that governments are able to limit the freedoms listed in this as it is necessary to preserve a free society. So what that basically means is that you can practice whatever religion you want, but if you claim to the government that you killed your neighbor because it was necessary for your religious rights, the government can still say, yeah, that's not a valid defense. You can't kill your neighbors. So there's that kind of conversation. This is where we're sort of running into questions about things like female genital mutilation, around rights to sort of earn income and that kind of thing, in many sort of contemporary contexts around the rights of women. It is also the provision that allows governments to, for example, have both freedom of expression, which is the freedom to say whatever you want, and laws that criminalize hate speech. Because from the perspective of the government, limiting hate speech is necessary to preserve a free society, despite the existence of freedom of expression. So there's that kind of piece. There's some other really important, there's another important clause that you need to sort of get to understand how this document functions, and that is the notwithstanding clause, which is one you may have heard of, but most of my students come in not really understanding. I'm not a constitutional scholar. There are lots of people who understand this better than I do, but here is the notwithstanding clause 101 sort of version. And this is introduced kind of as a way of allowing provinces to preserve their autonomy in certain ways and certain areas. And this is essentially a law, like a clause in the Constitution, that allows provinces to pass laws notwithstanding what is in the Charter. So despite what's in the Charter, we're going to make this law that contravenes the Charter anyway. And this is not an easy provision to use. If you're going to invoke the notwithstanding clause, you actually have to, the provincial governments are required to renew it every 5 years, so you have to have a debate about the passing of that notwithstanding clause every 5 years, and that 5-year date is not accidental. The 5-year date means that you will always have a new election, a new provincial election, before you come back to discussing that. Because that means that you have to sort of have at least, you have a change in, a potential anyway, for a change in government, right? What the electorate does or does not do is not sort of guaranteed by that. But it means that if you are a brand new government and on day one you pass a law that requires the use of the notwithstanding clause, 5 years from that date, you are going to have to, like the government, the population of your province is going to have had an opportunity to elect a new government if they don't like the law that you passed with the notwithstanding clause, and you have to sort of renew it in that way. It is not, in practice, a clause that gets used very often, okay? So Quebec, again, kind of connected to their disdain of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, kind of includes the, notwithstanding the Charter clause in many of the provincial laws they pass, including when it's not particularly necessary, i.e. including when those laws do not, in fact, contravene the Charter. This is becoming a really interesting conversation around Quebec's Bill 21, for those of you who've sort of been following that conversation, because there's a discussion about whether or not Quebec's Bill 21 is actually a violation of sort of protections against discrimination for race, religion, and sort of that kind of thing, because it limits the ability to wear religious symbols in the provision and receiving of public service. So whether or not you can wear, for example, a hijab while being a public school teacher or a nurse, that kind of thing is really important in that kind of conversation. And there's some discussion that that law, that Bill 21, may actually contravene the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but Quebec, for the last sort of 30, 40 years, has sort of defensively, I guess, included the notwithstanding clause in many of their laws. It was necessary. They did actually need to invoke the notwithstanding clause to be able to pass language laws and language protection laws, at least up until 1993. After 1993, they kind of like modified that. And then pretty much one of the only uses of the notwithstanding clause outside of Quebec is, again, a threat more than an actual sort of attempt to use it, and it's from Alberta. So in 2000, the government of Alberta threatened to use the notwithstanding clause to establish laws in Canada, in Alberta anyway, that would have sort of said, notwithstanding that the federal law says same-sex marriage is a thing, we're going to make a law in Alberta that says that marriage exists only between one man and one woman, although it was never actually invoked. So it's sort of a threat, and it's a way of preserving a possibility of autonomy, but it is important to understand that it is not used very often. Broadly speaking, most of what a big part of what convinced Canadians to care at all about constitutional change in the 1980s is the inclusion of the notwithstanding clause. Sorry, not the notwithstanding clause, but the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because enshrining that kind of democratic and liberal democratic rights formally in Canadian law about the right to free association and all those sorts of things is considered to be really, really important, and that is a compelling case to Canadians. The idea about, we need to change the formula by which we amend our Constitution, and here's 300 pages of complex constitutional law, not all that appealing to most people. But the conversation about, hey, as we're doing this like boring constitutional law thing, we're also going to give you this short, like if you actually read the entire Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's not very long, like 5 pages, and it's a guarantee of all of these freedoms for protection from unreasonable government action and protection for what are sort of coming to be known as human rights at the time. That is a compelling case. And that is a conversation that convinces people to like write to their MPs and their MLAs saying, yeah, I think it's a really great idea for us to protect these freedoms for all Canadians and all that sort of stuff. So a large part of what convinces people to show up and care about this sort of constitutional issue is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is one of the reasons that it is important to understand.